So my first question is, we talk a lot about how racism is foundational in the US. Can you describe for us what that means?
Yes, racism is usually discussed in this country as a matter of racial prejudice and racist attitudes, especially of white Americans. And it's much less often discussed as foundational and systemic.
Mhm.
But if you're going to understand racism in the United States of America, you have to understand that it is foundational and systemic. And by foundational, I mean that literally. It's built in to the fundamental economic and political system of this country from our first century or two.
Okay, so that's a really good kind of reminder about the time depth that we're talking about with foundational racism. And so, can you tell us a little bit more about how you kind of conceive of the timeline of racism in US history?
Yes, I think if you're going to understand racism at all, and especially if you're going to understand systemic and foundational racism, you have to understand that it's been operating in this country now for 415 years. And when I teach a class or give a lecture with visual aids to it, I put on the blackboard or on the screen a timeline, a horizontal timeline running from 1607. That's when Jamestown, later Virginia, was founded by the English colonists. And at the other end of that timeline is today, 2022. So we've had racial oppression in this country for 415 years. African Americans who were enslaved were imported in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, just 12 years after the colonial founding of Jamestown. Even in that first 12 years, the colonists were discriminating against and dealing with Native Americans, so you've already got elements of systemic racism in those first 12 years. But especially after they imported African Americans who were enslaved in 1619, then you have the oppression of African Americans as part of white systemic racism. So at the very beginning of the first colony, first English colony, you have racial oppression targeting Native Americans and also very quickly targeting African Americans. So slavery ends on that timeline in 1865. That's 246 years of slavery as foundational to our economic system and as foundational to our governing and political system in the colonies, later states, and then in the country as a whole. Most Americans and most analysts of the United States, even those looking at racism, do not realize that 60% of U.S. history, most of U.S. history, is a slavery economic and political system. That slavery system, once it's destroyed by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, is replaced by a brief Reconstruction period when we had extensive multiracial democracy where Black Americans were freed. Mm-hmm. But rather quickly, the federal government gave up in enforcing the Reconstruction laws and allowed the old Southern white slaveholding oligarchy to take over the country again. That oligarchy replaced the old slavery with the near slavery of what we call Jim Crow segregation. And that Jim Crow near slavery lasts from about the 1870s or so to the late 1960s, another 90 or so years. Now, slavery and Jim Crow are two of the world's worst ever systems of racial oppression. And that's 82% of our history, the two combined. The overwhelming majority of this country's history, 82%, is made up of these two extreme systems of racial oppression. And you can see we do not teach that very well, even at all, in our K through 12 schools. Mm-hmm. And even in colleges, you often have to take special extra courses to even begin to learn how deep that racist history is. To make it short, right, systemic and foundational racism means it's been part of all of this country's major institutions for most of this country's history. And by the way, since Jim Crow ended, we still have widespread informal discrimination that violates both the laws of the Reconstruction period and the civil rights laws of the 1960s. We do not enforce our civil rights laws very well. Right. So the legacy of Jim Crow is still with us in widespread informal discrimination in housing, education, employment, the political system, you name it.
Absolutely. So I do think that that's such an important way to think about it, that 82% of our history is reflecting codified racist laws, right? And then we add on to that kind of what you are calling more of a period of time where there are laws that aren't enforced very well, and there's, you know, inequality and discrimination throughout so many systems in the US. But that 82% is such a kind of mind-blowing number. So you've answered this a little already, but why do you think it's important for students in the US to really get a sense of that timeline?
The main reason for that is to understand how deep and foundational and systemic that it's there generation after generation after generation. You know, there are two ways to think about that timeline. One is it's 415 years. The other way to think about it is it's about 20 generations of human lifetimes. So for African Americans and Native Americans, you've got about 18 generations of those 20 where you and your families are facing extreme racial oppression. You're being unjustly impoverished for 18 generations. And if you're white, even if you're a white immigrant, like my ancestors were poor Irish immigrants, and they've been here since 1790. They don't go back that whole period. But since 1790, because they're white, they've been able to pass along the generations wealth they gained, to the point that my dad was the first to go to college, and then he got a good job with Exxon and put 3 kids through private universities. If we had been black anywhere along that timeline from 1790, that wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't be here. So you can look at it as generations, and I know that's a question later, right? But the social reproduction of wealth over the generations has been possible for white generations for at least 10 to 20 generations. The social reproduction of wealth, that is, passing it from parents to children, grandparents to parents to children, has only happened for almost all Americans of color, especially the ones who've been here that whole 400 years, has only been possible the last 2 generations. Since the Civil Rights Acts went into effect in 1969, we've only been an officially free country for about 53 years.
Right.
Of those 415.
Right.
Up until 1969, we were a totalitarian, undemocratic, authoritarian country, especially if you were Black, Native American, Mexican American. You didn't have full citizenship rights until 1969. The Third Civil Rights Act goes into effect.
I really think that the way you frame that is really important. I think that that's not something we either think about or talk about, that we really, even though our country, in the grand scheme of countries around the world, we're a young country still, but even then, we haven't been free for all of our citizens, but for a very short period of time. So I like how you stated that it's only been since about 1969 did all of our citizens even remotely start to have access to what it means to be a citizen of a country.
And to pass along resources.
And then to be able to pass along resources and kind of build up this access to citizenship and also access to wealth that then can become, more of this systemic existence here. That's such a powerful way to put that.